Oh, somebody just came in. Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Kathy Catoni. Well, I should say Kathy McCarthy Catoni to get my Irish in there and supersede my Italian. Anyway, today we are very pleased to have with us Natalie Bodel. Am I saying that right, Natalie?
That's right.
Okay, very good. She is a full-time professional genealogist, educator, and author who undertakes ancestral research throughout the UK and Ireland, specializing in Irish and Scots-Irish genealogy research. She has a postgraduate certificate in genealogical studies from the University of, you'll have to help me with this one,
Strathclyde.
Strathclyde, I guess it's just like it's spelled. Built upon many years of family history research experience and is a member of the Association of Professional Genealogists. She is a frequent speaker on the local, national, and international circuits on Irish genealogy topics and delivers regularly genealogy courses with a focus on Irish records. A native of County Antrim, her company Roots Revealed is based in Ballymena. Did I say that correct?
Ballymena.
Ballymena, in Antrim, Northern Ireland. Her first book, Tracing Your Family History Using Irish Newspapers and Other Printed Materials, was published by Pen and Sword in 2024. And I have that book on order now, Natalie. So let us welcome Natalie to our group. And we sure appreciate you being here, Natalie. One question I do have for you, Natalie, before we start is how would you like questions handled? Do you want them typed into the chat for at the end? Would that be?
Yeah, so I would prefer to answer them at the end, but whether people want to just speak, or if they want to type them into the chat and you moderate them, that's I don't mind either way, but we could just leave them to the end. I think it would be easier.
Okay, then I think we should have, if you have a question for Natalie along the way, type the question into the chat, and at the end, I'll read them one by one to Natalie. So thank you very much. And let's hear about the Irish ancestors. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak to you tonight. So it's 8 o'clock in the evening here in Ballymena, County Antrim. Now, I am just going to turn off my video since we are transmitting across the ocean just to save on bandwidth. So as long as you don't mind, I will just turn off my video, and hopefully that will help to circumnavigate any potential connection issues. Okay.
All righty.
And I'll turn it back on, obviously, once we finish the presentation.
Okay.
So now the workhouse was an institution that struck fear and dread into everyone. Nobody wanted to go into it if they possibly could avoid it. And the fear was that once you were in there, you would never come out again. And the workhouses were known to be harsh, uncomfortable, and forbidding places. So what we're going to have a look at today are the workhouses, why they came into existence in the first place. And then we will look at the Ballymena workhouse, which is the one in my hometown, and we'll look at that as a case study. Then we will look at some of the records that you can find and the various places that you can find them, and some of the finding aids that can help you to locate workhouses or information about them in Ireland. So as Kathy said there, we'll keep the questions to the end, and we'll deal with those at the end. Now, there is also a handout that has been supplied that Kathy has emailed to people, and that is going to be made available, I think Kathy said, in the chat as well. Now, in ancient Ireland, there had been a long tradition of caring for the sick and the poor. And one of the earliest hospitals was founded about 300 BC at Armagh by Princess Macha. And she is the person after whom Armagh or Ardmagh is named. So when Christianity arrived, the monasteries provided the poor with food and drink and clothing. And many of these also had infirmaries and houses for lepers. The monks who lived there grew herbs and they practiced bone setting and surgery. The dissolution of the monasteries began by Henry VIII in 1533, saw a number of the Irish monasteries destroyed, although the extent of his power in Ireland was limited. There was a series of rebellions and plantations and dispossessions, and these meant that by 1750, only about 7% of the land in Ireland was actually owned by the native Irish. The descendants of some of the former great landowners were to be found working as labourers on their bottom rung of the ladder. And so the collapse of the old Gaelic structure meant that a support system that had been in place no longer existed. And the suppression of the monasteries meant that the poor, the sick, and the elderly had little help. Dean Jonathan Swift, who was a Church of England minister, became the Dean of St Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, and he lived from 1667 to 1745. And he was one of the foremost political commentators of the day. You may know him better as the author of Gulliver's Travels, which was written in 1726. But even with the levels of poverty that he discussed in this excerpt here, the population of Ireland continued to grow. And of course, this compounded the situation in the country. Now, the Church of Ireland, which was the established church in Ireland until 1874, often took on the role of providing poor relief and taking on the care of orphaned children. So, for example, the vestry minutes of Newry Church of Ireland in County Down, and Newry straddles the counties of Armagh and Down. So the vestry minutes of the Newry Church of Ireland has regular entries where they send foundling children to the hospital in Dublin. They paid for the upkeep of the poor in the poorhouse, and they paid for the care of orphan children by parishioners. Now, there were some charitable institutions founded, but there were never enough, and the assistance for the needy and the poor was not consistent or organised. In 1703, the Irish Parliament passed an act for the erection of a house of industry in Dublin for the employment and maintenance of the poor of the city. And this was the first attempt at an official response to deal with the problem. Now, the workhouse in Dublin was managed by a body called the Governor and Guardians of the Poor, and they had the power to apprehend idle vagrants and beggars and to put them to work in the workhouse for up to 7 years. The main classes of people that they provided for were sturdy beggars, disorderly women, and the old and the infirm and orphaned children. The inmates of the workhouse slept in large cellars that slept 160 people. Their diet consisted of gruel, which was a thin porridge that could be drunk instead of eaten, and also some bread, milk, and porridge. They could be flogged if they were particularly troublesome, and they could be transported abroad without trial. There were so many abandoned children that part of the workhouse became a foundling hospital. And it admitted orphaned and deserted children in the normal way. And also at one of the gates, a basket was fixed to a revolving door. So those who wished to abandon a child placed the child in a basket, rang a bell and departed, leaving the child to be collected by the porter. The church wardens also engaged lifters, as they were called, who made nightly rounds of the city. And they lifted any abandoned children found lying in public places. And the children were either taken to the foundling hospital or given the bottle, which consisted of a dose of narcotic and had the twin effects of preventing crying and putting the child out of its misery. There was also a real concern about the number of vagrants and beggars coming into Belfast. The Belfast Charitable Society was set up in 1752 by local gentlemen and merchants, and this marked the beginning of services for poor in Belfast. Now, they raised funds by a lottery to build a poorhouse and an infirmary, which opened in 1774 on land that was granted by Lord Donegal, who was the largest landowner in the area. Now, the regime here was always much more humane than the union workhouses that came later. So, for example, husbands and wives were not separated but had a double bed with curtains around it. Inmates were provided with soap, snuff, and tobacco. However, punishments such as being fed bread and water were stated out for bad behaviour, and there was a black hole with a bricked up window. A school was provided that could be attended by children from outside the poorhouse, and an outpatient service was started in 1776, where patients could attend twice a week for advice and assistance. On the 9th of June 1778, John Wesley, the evangelist, wrote in his journal about the Belfast poorhouse and noted that the old men, the old women, the male, female children are all employed according to their strength, and all their apartments are airy, sweet, and clean, equal to anything of the kind I have seen in England. Clifton House, as it was known, refused to come under the control of the Belfast Poor Law Union, but remained independent. And the Clifton Street building still stands today, and sheltered accommodation is provided for 70 elderly people. And the tours are provided of the Clifton poorhouse. And the nearby Clifton Street Cemetery, where victims of the cholera epidemic of 1832 to 33 and of the Great Famine are buried in mass graves. So it's well worth a visit if you ever do get the opportunity. Here you can see an image of it on a beautifully sunny day in Belfast. That's a bit of a rarity now, I have to say. Now, following the 1798 United Irishmen Rebellion, the Act of Union in 1800 meant that Ireland lost its own parliament and was governed directly from England. By 1820, Ireland had become one of the most densely populated countries in Europe, with a population of about 6.5 million, and it had thousands of people unable to support themselves and their dependents. There was high unemployment, and the rents for many were too high to be affordable. Many labourers and small farmers relied on growing enough potatoes to feed their families and to have a small surplus to be sold. So it was very much a hand-to-mouth existence for many people. Poverty was widespread, and it was estimated that over 2 million people were at near starvation level in Ireland. So there was no legal provision for the poor, the aged, and the infirm, who could only rely upon charity. In an account of the living conditions of the Irish people to the House of Lords Select Committee on the State of Ireland in 1825, Daniel O'Connell, a famous reformer, described how the lower class lived in one-room cabins built of mud that let in the rain, with whole families sleeping in one room. Their bedding was of straw, and they had little, if any, furniture, and their diet consisted of potatoes and buttermilk or water. Numerous commissions and committees had reported on the state of affairs in Ireland, but still nothing was done. Now, the introduction of the Poor Law in England in 1834, the deluge of immigrants left Ireland to go to England, where they could be assured of food, clothing, and shelter under the new Poor Law system. But these growing numbers meant that there was demand in the towns and cities of England to introduce the same Poor Laws into Ireland. And then eventually the Act for the Relief of the Destitute Poor in Ireland was enacted in 1838. Now, the country was divided into unions that centred on market towns, and a workhouse was to be provided in each of the unions that were designated. A poor rate was in effect a tax levied on local inhabitants to pay for the poor relief, but this became very difficult to collect in many areas. A board of guardians was appointed in each union to administer the workhouse. And the principle of the workhouse system was that the inmates of the workhouse should be worse clothed, lodged, and fed than those who were in employment outside it. And this was designed to produce such a horror of the workhouse that nothing short of absolute destitution and necessity would compel anyone to seek relief there, and to ensure that they would leave it as speedily as possible. And relief was only to be given to those who entered the workhouse. And also, people were to be assisted to emigrate. Now, the workhouses were built to a similar design, and there were three different types depending on the size required. So there were small ones for 200 to 300 people, medium ones for between 400 to 600 people, and large ones for 1,000 or more. All were capable of expansion to accommodate a further 100 to 200 people. And it was stipulated that they were to be cheaply built, though durable, be simply arranged, and be devoid of decoration. And actually, there's testament to their durability that many of the buildings still stand today. Now, as well as the administration block, the male and female wards, the school and children's wards, there was an infirmary and what was termed at the time idiot wards, as you can see on the top of the screen there, the top of the image. Now, in order to qualify for relief, the whole family had to enter the workhouse together when they were then separated. Fathers and sons went to the male quarters, mothers and daughters to the female section. Children over 2 were separated from their parents and sent to the children's wards. No provision had been made in the legislation for unmarried mothers, but it became the custom for them to go to the workhouse infirmary to have their children. In the workhouse, the inmates were fed and clothed, but it was a fundamental rule that no one who was capable of work should be idle at any time. So they were set to work with men breaking stones, grinding corn, working on the land attached to the workhouse. The women did duties, mended clothes, washing, attended the children and the sick, as well as manual work that included stone breaking. The lack of water, no toilet facilities, and overcrowded, poorly ventilated dormitories meant that disease was rife. The mortality rate was very high among both inmates and staff. There were many rules, and the master was able to punish anyone who disobeyed them. Now, the potato had been introduced to Ireland in the mid-1700s, and it was a crop that could grow in almost any soil, took little labour, and it was nutritious, and that contributed to the rise in the population to over 8 million by 1841. So while wheat, barley and oats were also grown, it was exported, and the peasantry relied on the potato to feed themselves and their families. Now, even though the potato crop had failed 24 times in various parts of the country between 1728 and 1851, the population still kept growing. In 1845, the blight arrived, and it became known as An Gorta Mór and the Great Famine. So this fungal disease could destroy the potato crop in a matter of hours. The following year, it was clear that the crop had failed in most parts of the country. And between 1845 and 49, the crop failed in 3 seasons out of 4. The result was starvation and the spread of dysentery, typhus, and cholera. The blight coincided with a downturn in the linen industry, which seriously affected the income of many of the home-based handloom weavers, many of whom combined that income with small farming. Fever hospitals were set up alongside the workhouses, but it was still only possible to get relief if you entered into the workhouse, and many still had an enduring horror of it. Now, there were various contributing factors to the Great Famine, so that the quality of land. Now, some areas of the country had much higher areas classified as bog and waste, such as, for example, 2/5 of County Donegal and 28% of counties Londonderry and Tyrone. In the 1700s, there was an encouragement to reclaim the bogland, and the potato was often cultivated on this type of land. So by the middle of the 18th century, the potato had become the staple diet of labourers and cottiers, along with milk. And the food of the people was for at least 9 months of the year, except for Ulster, where most people still had oat bread and some meat. The housing quality was another factor, and in 1841, the census had shown that over 500,000 families were living in 4th-class accommodation. So these were one-room cabins with mud walls and roofs made with organic material, usually sods, often shared with livestock. Now, these would not have been healthy to live in. The average for the province of Ulster was 29%, while the province of Connaught had nearly 1/2 of houses in this category. In areas where there was work to be had, in the towns and factories where people earned a wage and therefore could buy food, those areas where people were dependent upon their own labour were generally areas where there was greater levels of impoverishment. So in Ulster, 32% of families were engaged in manufacturing, trades and related activities, in comparison with 15% in Connacht and 19% in Munster. Now, during the 19th century, Con-acre land was normally let on an 11-month system, and that was considered to be a sufficient length to sow and harvest a crop, but without creating a formal relationship between the landlord and the tenant. Sorry, excuse me, my cat is interrupted here. Now, holding the land under Con-acre didn't grant any legal rights to the land. Rent was paid in cash, in labour, or in a combination of both. And for those who had Con-acre in lieu of wages, they had nothing to fall back on. And then, of course, literacy levels was a contributing factor too, because the ability to read health-related poor law notices and other notices such as shipping lists was considered to be a crucial skill in being able to deal with the famine conditions. And then, of course, different landlords had different approaches. The reactions of the large landowners varied. Now, Charles William Vane Stewart, who was the third Marquess of Londonderry, owned large estates across Ulster, and he was opposed to any relief committees or relief works being established in North County Down, which is where he had his county home at Mount Stewart near Newtownards. Even though that town, the town of Newtownards, had experienced real hardship. In this normally prosperous town, there were queues at the soup kitchen of emaciated and half-famished souls covered with rags, while in south of County Down, around Rathfriland and in the Mourns, conditions were even worse. Captain Brereton, the Board of Works officer who observed the landlord's reluctance to strike a rate and establish relief works there, noted the great desire of the landed proprietors to hide the poverty of the people. Now, Stuart's second wife was Lady Frances Anne Vane Tempest, and she was the only child of Sir Henry Vane Tempest and Lady Anne Catherine, the Countess of Antrim, in her own right. The family home was at Glenarm Castle in the Glens of Antrim. Most of the Antrim estate passed to Lady Charlotte Kerr, the younger sister of the deceased countess, but Lady Frances inherited 20 town lands with an annual rent of £2,500, as well as extensive collieries in County Durham. She built Guarantor, which is the picture in the middle of your screen there, as her summer residence. And it was built in stages between 1848 and 56. And records show that even though this was not a famine relief scheme, but there's no doubt that it did help to provide paid employment for local people. She supplied blankets and clothing, she provided free turnip seed and built lime kilns where they might procure burnt lime for the better dressing of their land. Her land agent established an estate clothing society in which tenants paid half price for various articles they required, and they set up the Glencloy Relief Committee. They offered cash prizes for the best built pigsties, and she hoped to banish these domestic creatures from the dwelling houses. To those tenants who replaced their thatched roofs with slates, she made a cash payment of about £4, and she sent over brushes which were issued on loan to tenants that they might whitewash the interiors of their cottages, and this was known to be like a disinfectant, have a disinfectant effect. In 1845, Dennis Mahon, a major in the 9th Lancers and a local magistrate, took over the Strokestown estate in Roscommon. Now, there were rent arrears of £13,000, and Mahon appointed a land agent who proposed to clear the estate of hundreds of small holding families. There were disagreements and accusations of bigotry from the local Roman Catholic clergy, and Mahon was also accused of having spent time enjoying himself in London when his people were left to starve and die in the street. During early 1847, some 1,400 tenants were offered emigration. Their arrears were forgiven and their passage was paid to Canada. Two vessels with 217 families, or 810 people, agreed to these terms, while 3,006 people were evicted from their homes on the estate. It was later estimated that most died within the year in the workhouse or on the roads. Now, the ships hired were badly run, and 268 people died at sea. The medical inspectorate at Gros Isle, Quebec, described the survivors as ghastly, yellow-looking spectres. Rumours that one of the ships had foundered in the Atlantic and that Machen had deliberately sent them to their deaths spread in Connaught. And as he came from a meeting of the Poor Law Guardians at Roscommon on the evening of the 2nd of November 1847, Machen was shot dead by one of several assailants at a bridge, Strokestown, and the local peasantry celebrated with bonfires on the surrounding hills. Many people were evicted from their homes because they could no longer afford to pay their rent. And eventually a torrent of people sought refuge in the workhouses. By 1851, the numbers had reached 217,000, so nearly 250,000. One visitor described the terrible state of the workhouses that he visited, including Glentees in County Donegal, where the people were half starved and only half clothed. The bedding was of dirty straw on the floor, and as many as 6 people were living and dying under one rug. Overcrowding in the workhouses accelerated the spread of disease, and the poor diet meant and lack of clothes and uncaring guardians all added to further mortalities. The workhouses had to stop admitting people because they were full to capacity and they could cope with no more. People were dying in their homes and in ditches in the road, and people were buried in mass graves and without coffins. A system of public works was introduced, but thousands were turned away, and the money earned was often not enough to buy enough food to feed a family. The English newspapers started to send artists to Ireland to record the scenes, and there was such widespread concern that the government was forced to change its policy, and they introduced soup kitchens to provide food for those who were unable to gain admission to the workhouse. In 1848, this was succeeded by outdoor relief, meaning that the destitute could obtain relief without entering the workhouse. Initially, however, this excluded those who farmed land of 1/4 of an acre or more. So the effect was that only those small farmers either stayed on their land and starved or had to give it up to their landlord. The Colonial Land Immigration Commission was set up in 1840 to organise and supervise immigration from both Britain and Ireland to the British colonies. And the aim was to reduce the numbers on poor relief, but it was also a form of colonisation of countries under British rule, so Australia, Canada and New Zealand in particular. But many of the Irish immigrants tended to prefer the United States of America, which of course was no longer a British colony at that time. Those who were selected for immigration were offered free passage and supplied with clothing and a little money to support themselves on arrival. Landowners also undertook their own immigration schemes, paying the passage or chartering ships. They then cleared the land of the cabins as the tenants left. And if a tenant refused his landlord's offer of immigration, he could often find that his cabin was demolished anyway. One such landlord was Earl Fitzwilliam in County Wicklow, where his agents arranged for the immigration of 300 families comprising of over 1,600 people. If they refused to go, their cabins were destroyed, leaving the people homeless. The ships that took the immigrants often had dreadful conditions and were nicknamed coffin ships because so many died on board before they ever landed in the new country. The Earl Grey assisted immigration scheme ran from 1848 to 1850, and it sent over 4,000 female children from Irish workhouses to Australia. It aimed to provide labourers there and to resolve the overcrowding in the workhouses. The girls, who were aged between 14 to 20, came from all 32 counties of Ireland. And while they may still have had one parent living, that father or mother could no longer support them. The Earl Grey scheme was abandoned in 1850. It became difficult to find employment for the girls, many of whom didn't have adequate training, and also a growing anti-Irish, anti-Catholic sentiment. As a result of the famine, about 1 million died from starvation or fever, and it's thought about 2 million people emigrated. Between 1841 to 50, 49% of the total immigrants to the United States were Irish. Ireland's population continued to decline, however, because of immigration and a lower birth rate. Now, some have claimed that the famine didn't affect the province of Ulster as much, mainly due to it being more prosperous because of the linen industry. But this has been debunked by historical research. Between 1845 to 51, Ulster's population fell by 340,000, which is a drop of 15%, compared with an average of 19% for the whole of Ireland. County Fermanagh lost almost 30% of its inhabitants. Counties Tyrone, Antrim and Armagh were closer to the national average, with rates of around 18%. Life in the workhouse was harsh and it was often brutal. These women here are picking oakum, which is taking apart old ropes, and it was very hard on the fingers. And this is where the saying, money for old rope, comes from. The loose fibres were often sold to shipbuilders for mixing with tar to seal the lining of wooden craft. And this could be used then to make matting or bandaging. The Perrot wheel, designed by Richard Perrot of Cork, was used for grinding corn and could keep up to 100 inmates, including children, walking around and round in circles for hours. It was eventually seen as inhumane and was discontinued after about 5 years. And here are some photographs showing the female uniform and the men at dinner. And you can see how regimented the men sitting at dinner are in those rows, nice, neat, tidy rows. Now, the system in each of the workhouses was very similar, and many of us will have had relatives who have a connection of some sort to the workhouse. So, for example, in my own family, I have a great grandfather who was the porter in Ballymoney Workhouse, and I have a great grandmother who was admitted to the Ballymena Workhouse Infirmary in 1918 and died there after giving birth, and she was buried in an unmarked grave. Now, the National Health Service that we have in the United Kingdom didn't come into existence until 1948. And before that, if people were unable to pay for healthcare, they had no choice but to go to the workhouse infirmary if they desperately needed treatment. So taking a look at Ballymena Workhouse in County Antrim as a bit of a case study, the Ballymena Poor Law Union covered an area of 252 square miles, and it was overseen by a board of guardians that was 34 strong and met each Saturday at 1 p.m. Ballymena Workhouse was built on a 6-acre site, and the cost of the building was £6,000 plus £1,800 for fixtures and fittings. It admitted its first inmates on the 17th of November 1843, and it could accommodate 900 inmates, but the records do show that it was never filled to capacity, even during the famine years. Along with Ballymoney to the north and Antrim to the south, Ballymena had lower levels of relief and expenditure than the rest of Ireland. So there was industrial work to be had in Belfast, which is nearby, and there was also seasonal work in Scotland that many travelled across for. But there was still need, and in January 1848, the Ballymena Guardians authorised outdoor relief of 1 cooked meal per day for 6 months for the infirm and for widows with 2 or more legitimate children. A pamphlet published in 1847 by Alexander Shafto Adair, who was the major landlord in the area, described the situation with men looking for work and the setting up of soup kitchens. Now, the workhouse was not a pleasant place to be, and these are some of the punishments that were meted out in the Ballymena Workhouse. When they were first established, it was assumed that the able-bodied would make up a fair number of the inmates, and between 1851 to 60, they accounted for 26%. But by 1905, the picture had changed, and of the 45,000 inmates in 159 workhouses throughout Ireland, the majority were sick, aged, or infirm, while others as lunatics or epileptic, and 5,900 were children. Only 4% of the total were able-bodied. The Royal Commission of 1906 criticised the harsh discipline and to be found in the workhouses and recommended that the system be abolished and district hospitals be set up to care for the sick. Now, the workhouse closed in 1947, the workhouse in Ballymena, this is, and it was subsequently converted into the Braid Valley Hospital. The black stone facade of the workhouse, or the hospital rather, is what remains of the workhouse. So that, as you can see, is still standing and it's still a very sturdy building. And this is the 1901 census. It lists the staff in the Ballymena workhouse. And you can see from this particular entry here, you've got the workhouse master, the matron, who's Martha Kelly, Patrick Gregg is the master. You've got Elizabeth Robinson, who's a school mistress, and then you have a number of nurses. You go down, sort of down to number 9 there. John Blair is the lunatic caretaker, as is Henry Johnson and Henry Adger. And then a few more lunatic caretakers as well. So the lunatic wards were still in existence at that time. Now, even though the staff were, their full names were given, the inmates, generally, we only find their initials. So you only had to have the initials for the actual inmates themselves. So this is the 1901 census for the Ballymena workhouse as well. But sometimes there is sufficient information to be able to narrow down your ancestor. So for example, there you see the first entry there. So it's A.H. Is a Presbyterian. He cannot read. He is age 30. He is a male, I think it's male, or is it female? Not quite sure there. No, it might be female actually. Domestic servant, able-bodied, not married, born in County Antrim and in the town of Larne. So it's given us quite a bit of biographical detail there, useful information. And were they in hospital? So this person was not in hospital. And it can then give the reason for their entry into the workhouse. So here we see bodily infirmity for a person aged 54 and a person aged 68, 56 and also 68. And then we go on down, here's a 90-year-old person, a 90-year-old man who is a weaver and a widower, had been born in a hochel in County Antrim, and he was infirm. And it tells us how he was in, or how long he had been affected, rather, by this bodily infirmity, which was 7 years. So as I say, quite a bit of information there, which maybe, if your ancestor has got, particular age or a particular religion or a particular profession, you might be able to tie them down. There's an interesting one there, a cattle dealer, for example, born in Finicky. Now, these different institutions, the workhouses can be difficult to find in the census records. And there is a handy tool on John Grenham's Irish Ancestors website that we will look at in a few minutes. I'll show you how you can find that. Now, quite often there was a graveyard on the workhouse site, and these graves are unmarked. And this commemorative stone shows where the unmarked graves are for the Ballymena workhouse. And this is still in the grounds of the Braid Valley Hospital. So the commemorative stone and plaque was erected to mark the site of the grave. And it's not known how many people were buried in the workhouse graveyard. Not everybody who died there was buried at the same place, and because some people were claimed by their families and taken to their home graveyard to be buried. You see a list of names here, and this comes from the website of the Braid Mid-Antrim Museum, which is a record of burials and plot owners for various cemeteries in the Ballymena area. Now, if you are particularly interested in a particular town, a particular workhouse, it's always worthwhile just doing a Google search or checking on the local county archives to see what information there might be available, because a lot of the county archives particularly in the Republic of Ireland, have got much more information. In Northern Ireland, the information tends to be much more centralised as far as workhouses are concerned. But in the Republic of Ireland, we tend to find it spread out in different places. Now, how do you go about finding a workhouse? Well, the workhouses.org website, this is run by a man called Peter Higginbotham, and he has information about workhouses throughout the UK and Ireland. And he has a list of the workhouses for Ireland, a list of workhouses per county in Ireland, rather, I should say. So that's one way to find where the workhouses were. John Grenham's website, so I already mentioned John Grenham. He has on his Irish Ancestors website a very handy interactive tool where you can see the maps of the poor law union boundaries and also a list of the workhouse institutions recorded in the 1911 census, and I'll show you that just in a minute. Now, so the workhouses can be difficult to find because unless you know the name of the townland and that the workhouse was located in, it can be difficult. Just before I show you how to search all the information that's available on John Grenham's website, just do be aware that he allows a few free searches per day and then it goes behind a paywall. Now, I think it's €9.99 for I think it's a week or a month. I think it's maybe a month's access. Alternatively, you can just restrict your searches. But I'll just show you quickly then the information that's available. So I'm going to. Oh. So hopefully you can see there the Irish poor law unions. And you can see there it's got maps. So these color-coded maps of each of the poor law unions. Now, if we zoom in then, we can see that you've got the different areas shown. So these are each of the poor law unions, and this is one of a number of maps that you will be able to find online. And you can then click on each of those. So we go, let me see, we'll go to Baileyborough. You can click on there and you can see poor law unions and registrars district. It's telling you a bit more information about that. And we'll just scroll down there. So you can see there the areas then that make up the divisions within the Baileyborough area. So that is one option for finding the poor law units. That's quite useful because it allows you to sort of figure out where places are in relation to each other, and be aware that if someone was living in, for example, the Ballymena poor law union area, which was my hometown, maybe they heard that the regime in Gorchin was a bit more easy, maybe a nicer master, for example. Well, people just couldn't decide to go to Gorchin. They had to go to the one that was nearest to them, or that the poor law union that they were resident in that particular area. So that's the map of the poor law unions. And then if we look at the institutions in the 1911 census. Now, on this particular website, or in this particular section of John's website, what he has is actually different institutions. And you can see here barracks. So these will be army and police barracks. You've got colleges and boarding schools, hospitals, prisons, asylums, return of the sick in their own home, and workhouses. So you can play about with that in your own time. The source for that, the link to that is on your handout. And I'm just going to click on the workhouse and show you then. So all of these orange dots then are a workhouse. You can zoom in and it will tell you then, where a particular workhouse is. So there's Granard, for example, and it's telling us in 1911 there were 146 people in the workhouse at Granard. Obviously, the bigger the circle, the larger the workhouse. There is one in Westport, and there we have 126 people in the Westport Workhouse. So that's quite a useful tool as well, because particularly if you don't know the townland, it can be difficult to find the workhouses. And of course, these places are going to be in the same district electoral division in the 1901 census as well. Okay, so just go back to the presentation. So that's just finding aids for you. Now, so as we said then, the poor law unions centred on the market towns where the workhouse was built. The Board of Guardians were instructed to discourage all but the most needy paupers for applying to the workhouse for assistance, and no individual who was capable of exertion was permitted to be idle. So men were employed, usually manual jobs, as we said, and the women were employed in various jobs, and including manual work as well. Punishments that included breaking stones for a week, going without shoes for a week, being flogged for misdemeanors such as making noise when silence was ordered, not duly cleansing your person, playing cards or any game of chance. And they were obviously intended to deter any but the most desperate. So the outdoor relief that was granted to the aged, the infirm, and the sick, and to poor widows with 2 or more children. And the assisted emigration then, the Board of Guardians could raise money to enable immigration, preferably to the colonies, and they offered then that free passage and gave them clothing and little money to support themselves on arrival. Now, the admission, the types of registers that you can find, we'll cover that in a few minutes. But the records are closed for 100 years from the date of the last entry. So the records, as you can see there, the registers of admission and discharge, just move this out of the way, the minute books, so that would be minute books of the Board of Guardians, correspondence in and out of the workhouse and to the Board of Guardians, the account, so obviously they had to account for their expenditure, and various statistics were compiled. The outdoor relief, so people are named in that, and what their qualification was and how long they got the relief for and how much relief they got. And then you have the infirmary records. Children were boarded out sometimes, so those records can be maintained. There was a dispensary that was attached, and for the to the infirmary as well. And then, as I said, you tended to get women going in, particularly in the later years. It ended up that many of the single women who were given birth often went into the workhouse infirmary and gave birth there, stayed for, a week or so and then left, sometimes taking the child with them and sometimes leaving the child to be adopted. Vaccinations were run by the dispensary attached to the workhouse. And various other miscellaneous records. Now, obviously, the records that are going to provide that are of most use and of most interest are the admission and discharge records. But the survival can be quite patchy. So it's not a case of saying all of the records and all of the different types of records survive from the opening of a particular workhouse, because that is unfortunately not the case. So you really do need to check on the specific workhouse that you're interested in to see what records survive. So how do we find records? Well, for Northern Ireland, there is a difference, obviously, because of the partition of Ireland. The workhouse system was abolished in the newly formed Free State, which is nowadays known as the Republic of Ireland. So that's the 26 counties of the Republic of Ireland. And some of those buildings were repurposed, such as the now infamous mother and baby home at Tuam in County Galway. In Northern Ireland, the workhouse system remained in place until 1947, and many were taken over as local hospitals. So for PRONI, which is the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland, based in the Titanic Quarter in Belfast, the records are free to view. They're in person. They have a reference for BG, which stands for Board of Guardians. And as I said, the records are closed for 100 years. Now, not all of the records have survived for Northern Ireland either. But I suppose, interestingly, the minutes, even though they may not necessarily refer to your ancestor by name, they give an insight into the running and the administration of the workhouse. So I mentioned that my great-grandfather had been a porter in Ballymoney Workhouse, and the minutes show when he asked for leave, and he was entitled to a new suit every year. And there was also then a disagreement about the fireplace in his porter's lodge, because the grate was deemed to be too big. So clearly he was burning too much coal in the grate. So it was quite interesting just to be able to see that and to help to build a picture of his work in life. Now, I'll show you then just on the PRONI's website just how you can find more information about that. So just go there now. The front page of the PRONI website. And if we see here on the left-hand side of your screen, you have the e-catalogue. So you have the search PRONI's e-catalogue, and then just go to the catalogue. And if you go to the browse function is probably most useful for this, because if you go to browse, and then you go to, you can either type in BG, or you can go to the alphabetical bit. So I'll just type in BG and search. And then we go to BG Board of Guardians. And then what it does is it lists the various records. So each individual workhouse where there are records deposited in PRONI, they have a different number. So BG1 is Antrim, BG2 is Armagh, BG3 Ballycastle, and so on and so on. But what I just want to do is to show you, because there are actually some records, strangely enough, for areas in the Republic of Ireland. So here you can see Cork. Now, Cork is completely the very southern county in Ireland. It's in the Republic of Ireland, but here we have a reference for County Cork. Now, the others here are all Northern Ireland up above that. But here you can see more County Cork, County Monaghan, County Cork, Donegal, and so on. So they are all Cork, Monaghan and Donegal are all in the Republic of Ireland. So you can go in and just check and see what those records actually are. But if I want to go back and have a look at one of the, we'll have a look at Lurgan there, for example, BG22. So I can click on there, and then it's telling us what records there are that survive. So here we have minute books, and I can go into that and have a look and see. So the minute books are from 1839 to 48, and it's given me the reference number. There's a series of those, so there's a number of those books in there. I'll go in and just click on a wee bit more. So again, there is a list of the minute books. So you can see there are various dates, and it's given us the reference number for those as well. Now, that's how you then search on a particular workhouse for Northern Ireland and some in the Republic of Ireland to see what records there are that exist. Now, I just want to show you, just while I'm on this website then, for Belfast. So Belfast obviously was the biggest workhouse in Northern Ireland. So just want to go to BG again. So it's BG7. So Belfast is BG7. So I can click on there. And what they have for Belfast, now this is the only workhouse records for Northern Ireland that have been digitised and made available online. And it is the particular reference number of BG7 GK. So that is on this one here. So BG7GK, Indoor Register Indexes. Now, this is not the full record, but it's an index of names and dates. So they are listed per year and then alphabetically within each book. And you can see there's an index to the indoor register. The first one there is July 1892 to October 1892. So that's just a few months there of that particular year. And then you see the digital record here, view. So you can actually open that up and you can view the record. Now we'll just see how long it takes and see if this will download quickly for us, and we can open it up just to let you see what it looks like. So they usually ask you to agree that you're not going to use it for commercial purposes, and you just click the agree button. And there we are. So we'll just scroll down through here and you can see it's a scan of the actual book. So there we have it's alphabetical order. So Anderson is the surname, Alice is the forename. She was aged 21, the number in the register. So this is useful because you'll need this number or this will help you to locate her in the actual indoor admission register. And then you can just read across and see what other information there is. So Pauper's name, Nellie Anderson, age 21. Oh no, sorry, she's number 16 in the register. And then we have Nellie Anderson, who is number 2931 in the register. And Nellie was age 25, while Alice was age 21. And there you can see there's Nellie Anderson underneath her. So it's possible that Nellie was admitted a few different times. So that's just how you can find that information. And I'll just go back then to the presentation. Now, I mentioned about Clifton House. So Clifton Poor House has got its own separate collection. So Clifton House, even when the Poor Law Union came into effect, this is Clifton House in Belfast, they remained independent and they did not join in or become part of the Poor Law Union. So they have got their own separate collections. They've got records related to admissions, to deaths, and employment of, for example, apprentices in the workhouse, or the Poor House rather, as it's called. Local museums are another useful source, and I've shown you some of the examples of records from the Braid Mid-Antrim Museum. So they have got some of the burial records for the local workhouse. And as I said, the workhouses are the information in Northern Ireland as far as the workhouses themselves is much more centralised in Pronay, but in the Republic, local archives and county museums quite often have got their own collections. So always worthwhile just doing a check to see what those local archives and museums might have. Local newspapers is another useful source as well, because they usually carried information about the Board of Guardians meetings and about any particular events that occurred. So, for example, whenever Christmas came along, there was usually an article about, what the inmates were given for Christmas. So, they were given extra rations or, whatever. So this is the Belfast Workhouse Indoor Register Index, which I've already covered for you. The records do go up to December 1948, but just be aware that the privacy rules apply. So that 100-year privacy rule, so the books will be closed for 100 years after the date of the last entry. and you've got the reference numbers there. So there's actually 249 of those, but there will only be a certain number of those indexes that are available to view because of those privacy rules. Now, for mentioned, about Northern Ireland, where you can find records for Northern Ireland, and in the Republic of Ireland, county archives, libraries, and museums are a good bet. But the records for the Republic of Ireland are a bit more haphazard. So some were destroyed deliberately at the time of the formation of the new state, and some were lost. Some ended up in private hands, some in archives and libraries. And in many cases, all that does survive are the formal minute books of the boards of guardians. In the case of the Dublin unions, the records did make their way into the National Archives of Ireland. And the Poor Law Union records for County Mayo during the famine years are now in the National Library of Ireland. But most of the Poor Law records are in the county libraries or the archives. Now, Find My Past and Ancestry have been digitising some of the Poor Law records as well as Board of Guardian minutes. And there are some admission and discharge books. So there are some there. So if you do have a subscription to those websites, then it's worthwhile having a check to see what there is. Now, that was the workhouses and the poor law unions, but there is another interesting record set that dealt particularly with poverty. So these records, the poverty relief loans, this was a system that ran from 1821 to 1874. The records are held at the National Archives at Kew in England, and they relate to the Irish Reproductive Loan Fund. This was created in 1822 to provide short-term, low-interest loans to the industrious poor. And by industrious, that meant people who would use the loans for reproductive purposes. So, for example, a fisherman who needed money to repair a boat, or a farmer who wanted to purchase new seeds. The fund didn't require any capital or physical backing, but instead they required that each borrower have 2 guarantors to sign for the loan. In some cases, the role of guarantor is also called security or sureties. Now, the guarantors were often neighbours or close relatives, and if the borrower defaulted on the loan, then the responsibility for repayment would lie with the guarantor. And it's not unusual to find one or more record for an individual. So some people applied for loans on more than one occasion, or they may have been a borrower for one loan and then a guarantor on another. And in order to sign for a loan as part of this Irish Reproductive Loan Fund, a person was required to be at least aged 21. There was a follow-up on the records because officials came back to check on what the outcome was for each person. And you can also see some criminal records within these. So, for example, information about people who were sentenced or transported. The entry that you see here is from the poverty relief loans. Shows that Pat Calais lived at Slow Hill until July 1848 when he died there. And Michael Flynn also lived at Slow Hill until he died there in the summer of 1848. So, of course, this information predates the civil registration of deaths that only started in 1864. And this might be one of the very few references you could find for your ancestors. So that brings the talk to a conclusion, and I will just stop sharing now. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to try and answer them. And I'll just bring my camera back on.
That was awesome.
There we go.
I've got questions for you, but let me see what is in the chat. I'm not seeing any right now. If anyone has a question, please type in the chat. Okay. I have a couple people in the room here with me separate, so one of them has a question. So I'm going to let her ask.
Yes, so you said that the people who were buried in the grave, they were unmarked graves from the poorhouse. Did they at least write them down? So if somebody was searching to know what poorhouse they were in, at least they had the name? Or did they not even do that?
Well, no, they would have been recorded at the time. So, for example, one of the returns would have been deaths. The discharge book really would have recorded the death of someone. So someone would have been discharged from the poorhouse on death. So most cases, it would have been the case that the person would have been buried in the local graveyard attached to the poorhouse. Records were kept of the burials, but they haven't always survived to any great extent, unfortunately. So this is one of the problems that we have, for the lack of records. There is I know Ballymoney Workhouse, which is the next workhouse up north from me. It's about 11, 12 miles away from me. So they actually have got burial records as well, and those records can be found again in their local museum. So I think the records that they would have for their unmarked burials in the workhouse graveyard would be more extensive than survive for Ballymena, for example. So it's hit and miss. And again, you just can't say, oh yes, they'll all survive for a particular period of time or for a particular workhouse.
So to piggyback on that question, does that mean that we wouldn't be able to see that book until 100 years have passed since the last entry?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And the ones that are in Belfast at Prony, if they're not online, you have to go to Prony to see them. That is true?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
It's true. Okay. What other question? Oh, when you brought up the the Prony books that are viewable, you brought up the Belfast one. Now, I had told you at the very beginning that part of mine were from Holywood. Do you think there's a possibility that Holywood would go to Belfast for a poorhouse?
Yes, I would say Hollywood would have belonged to the Belfast Poor Law Union. Yes.
Okay, that's great. And one other question, when you brought up the Cork area, I noticed as you were scrolling through, there was a Castletown, which is, I know, the entry poor law union for my area of the Barra Peninsula. And I noticed that the dates went to 1924. So do you think that means that those are coming probably not online, but are probably going to be open?
Yes. So it depends on the date of the last entry, Kathy. So if the last entry in the particular book that you're interested in was the 31st of December 1924, then that book should be open.
Okay.
But if the last entry in the book wasn't until the 1st of April 2025, then it still wouldn't be open.
Okay. Okay, it looks like I have some new records to look for. We have one more question in the room. Go ahead.
I know how you're saying once the book was closed, it was 100-year wait. But why wouldn't they, for the people that died way before that, why wouldn't they, go from when they entered like 18 something, why would they go with them for the 100 years instead of wait to the very last person?
Well, it's more about the admission and discharge, I suppose. So we're looking at admission and discharge books. So it's the date of, so it might be a child, for example, who was admitted just over 100 years ago, maybe a newborn child, a child was born in the workhouse, for example. So they could still be named in a book, that was open. Potentially, they could still be alive. We just had news today, for example, of a 105-year-old World War II Royal RAF pilot who had fought in the Battle of Britain and many other battles during the Second World War. So he just died aged 105. So, there are people who, these records will still be, make reference to. So that's just the privacy laws that we have in this country. Now, civil registration records are slightly different. So, for example, civil registration of births are not publicly available for 100 years. Civil registration of marriage records are available after 75 years, and civil registration of deaths are available after 50 years. In fact, I must just check, just let me double check when the burial records. If you just bear with me a wee second, I'll check the date of the records for Ballymena Workhouse just to see what dates are on that particular sheet. Just give me a second, bear with me. Let me see. Yeah, so going up to 1933 on that particular list there. So that's the date of burial. So they may well be adhering to, so that's just internments. Yes, so internments, 1923 to 1947. So they would be adhering to the 50-year rule for those internments. So that is a burial, is the death, and they're probably adhering to the civil registration of deaths type legislation, but the books themselves that you will find, so discharge books in the archives will still only be available 100 years after the last entry. And I know because I remember I had been waiting very patiently to see the information about my great grandmother, who I mentioned had died in the infirmary. And I had to wait and be patient for a few years after she had died, actually.
How much time do you have to wait? Do you know?
Well, it depends just on when the last entry was. So it's 100 years after the last entry.
Okay.
So my great grandmother, for example, she died in 1918, and I think it was 2020 before I was able to view the book. I think that was around the date, but I certainly wasn't able to view it in 1918 because the book wasn't open, wasn't available.
For the Republic of Ireland, how long did those workhouses exist?
Well, remember now, the workhouses, at the time the workhouses were built, Ireland was one country.
Okay.
So the workhouses were built at the same time throughout the whole of Ireland. So Ireland was partitioned in 1921, and that's when we start to see a split in how things are done. So many of the workhouses in the newly formed Free State, which became the Republic of Ireland, then they closed down. So they closed the workhouse system down. But in Northern Ireland, which remained part of the United Kingdom, the workhouse system remained in place until 1947.
Okay, now I understand now. Thank you. I don't see any questions in the chat. Does anyone want to unmute themselves and ask a question before we say goodbye to Natalie? I'm not hearing anything, Natalie. I thank you so much. You are a wealth of knowledge here. And you will get with me tomorrow, correctly?
Yes, I will indeed. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I appreciate that. So
Okay.
thank you very much. And you have a good night's rest. It's only 5:15 here. We're just getting ready for dinner. You're getting ready for bed.
Yeah, it won't be too long.
Thank
Okay,
you very much.
Kathy.
Good night.
Thanks very much. Cheerio, everybody.
Cheerio.
I have questions for you.
Okay, wait, let me.
Yeah.
Stop the recording.
Now you can say that.
Thanks, Kathy.
You're welcome, Don. I think that's done.
Yes,
Yes, it is.
Pat, yeah, thank you.
Next time, hire me as your driver, you two.
Okay, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. For all,
I have no handout.
who is this call talking?
Carol Knopf's.
Oh, Carol, you didn't get one? I sent one to your email address.
I'll double check.
Okay, I will make sure I send it again.
Thank you.
Okay. Good night, Carol.
Night. Okay.
Still can't get it off.
Yeah, they're still on, I guess.
Wait a minute.
Oh. Jeez. Oh, end meeting.